This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
Commence the process.
I wonder, why has it taken this long to get justices nominated to the bench?
Ordinarily, the process of nomination requires the NJC, National Judicial Council, to make a recommendation to the president. It's quite difficult to say what exactly is the reason for that. You really can't place your hand at it, but I think it has to do with the processes.
Mm-hmm. There are some concerns, right, that there will the fact that we have this administration, or to be more specific, this president being the one who will oversee 11 justices confirmed to the bench, that, there might be some room for, I don't know if political influence. I'm careful with the allegation, right? The suggestion, yes, but it is a suggestion nonetheless, right? It is a concern for some people that we will see 11 justices that are appointed under one administration, and what it means for the relationship between the judiciary and the executive.
I mean, so there has been quite a lot of concerns, allegations, and all sorts on the media recently, with one of such concerns emanating from the bench of the Supreme Court. Justice Dettijo, retired now, who during his valedictory session raised a number of issues with the Supreme Court and made quite a number of allegations, some of which, as I speak with you, have not been investigated. I think his statements called for a thorough investigation with the view to preserve the integrity of the Supreme Court, or justices of the Supreme Court, because there's need for public confidence in whatever the judiciary does. But talking about the appointment of 11 justices by a president, that is not the case, really. It's the provision of the Constitution. It's what the Constitution provides. We have a vacuum at the Supreme Court bench, and the president, the recommendation of the National Judicial Council, has done what he was required to do, and subsequently approved by the Senate. I mean, if you look at the process, it wasn't something that depended on a single individual. It depended on the three arms of government: Judicial Council, President, approved by the Senate. There's nothing to suggest that the president is going to have influence on them. If there's any empirical evidence, then it will be good to place it forward so that it will be thoroughly addressed. But on the face of it, there is nothing to suggest that.
Sir.
And then historically, we have had justices that were appointed by a president, and in a number of cases gave judgments that were against the interest of the government that appointed him. So, I mean, we have had that in the past, and I believe that we'll continue to have that.
Right. So if
and that is also not to rule out the possibility of the influence. Yes, I mean, that could be there as well.
I hear you. One of the other issues that have been raised regarding the judiciary in Nigeria has been the issue around the independence of the judiciary. We've talked about on not just on this platform, but on lots of other media platforms, the conversation around the payment of salaries to the justices, taking care of their welfare, and so on and so forth. It's been mooted for a while. With a full complement of justices and the hope that cases will be resolved quicker. Is there anything else that needs to be done to ensure that this Supreme Court is not influenced by not just the suggestion of political will on the one hand, but if you want the expression, economic realities?
Okay. I mean, for starters, this year we're looking forward to the judiciary. In fact, as a matter of fact, since the appropriation bill is now an act, haven't been signed by the president, we can confidently say this year the judiciary has one of its highest budgetary allocation, with about 300% increment from what it had last year. So yes, we're looking forward to having some relatively financially comfortable position that the judiciary has been placed in. But talking about independence, I think that more has to be done to make the judiciary as independent as it should be. We all know that yes, funds standing to the credit of the judiciary is usually transferred to the head of the judiciary, being the CJN, through the NJC, and they further transfer it to the various courts. But the point was made by the Nigerian Bar Association in its memorandum to the Revenue and Mobilization Allocation Committee, RAMFAC, Fiscal Allocation Commission, to the extent that there should be a separate body that will be in charge of determining the remuneration of judicial officers. It shouldn't be done by an arm of the executive. That's a subtle way of clipping the wings of the judiciary, or making the judiciary not to be as independent as it should be.
Right.
And I hope that will be considered by the National Assembly and given effect.
Right, Mr. Bulus, thank you very much for speaking with us this morning. Our guest is Mr. Atsen Bulus, the legal practitioner and former chairman of the Nigerian Bar Association, Abuja chapter. He joined us to speak on the full complement of 21 judges at the Supreme Court. It's a provision that's required by the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
Inflation has risen once again. The latest Consumer Price Index report released by the National Bureau of Statistics shows that the rate rose to 28.92% as of December 2023. Food inflation continues to be a strong driver across the board, with states like Kogi, Kwara and Imo seeing the highest increases in food prices. With the government continuing to grapple with a struggling economy, what does the latest figure mean for everyday Nigerians? Joining us on this is Oluwasomi Akosile. Mr. Akosile is a research, strategy and data analyst. Good morning and welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, morning. Happy New Year. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Let's start with your reactions. Are you surprised by the numbers?
Well, worrisome, but absolutely not surprising. Just like you said, headline inflation printed at 28.90% in December. And when you compare that with what the print was in November, that was about 72 basis points from 28.2% in November. Absolutely pressures mounted across, both the food inflation basket, sub-basket, and the core inflation. Food inflation printed at, a whopping 33.93%. That's almost 34%. Core inflation that excludes volatile food prices and energy prices printed at 23.06%, 68 basis points, up from 22.38 in November. If you look at month-on-month figures, 2.29%, also, extremely elevated. And if you want to average, inflation numbers all through 2023, that amounts to about 24.52%. If you compare that with 2021 average, which was about 18.77%, you've seen a very significant drop. And that average amounts to about a 3-decade high. So, well, away from the numbers, and you really want to look at the drivers, just like I said, the numbers were not surprising, however, very worrisome numbers. And looking back at the past 2 years, from an economic standpoint, inflation has been a major focal point, basically across the globe, really. But unfortunately, whilst we saw a decelerating trajectory for inflation numbers across, major economies, for Nigeria, it was somewhat, opposite direction. And basically, you would want to zero in on the two major reforms that we witnessed when this administration came in: fuel subsidy removal, exchange rate unification, amidst other cost push factors. I mean, still grappling with very serious menace of insecurity that has heightened in the last few months, and obviously that impedes the adequate supply of food production, particularly from the food producing northern states, grappling with exchange rates, devaluation, also grappling with transportation cost, energy cost that cascades into high food prices. And if you look at the contributions from the reports released by the NBS, food contributed about 14.9, almost approximately 15% to the inflation numbers we saw. And that tells you the impact that food inflation has on the overall inflation basket. Well, right. I guess the question now is, do we see some respite going forward? And in my opinion, I really do not think so. The optics are still very much negative, looking at the lingering factors. However, base effects could trickle in. And for December, in particular, there was also the festivity induced demand, right, which obviously for January we're not likely to see that, and it could have even been higher, right? If not for the what's it called, the sort of subsidy we saw with free train rides.
Mr. Akosile, I apologize for interrupting you. But okay. This is a lot of, to use a common expression, bad news. But the First Bank of Nigeria has projected that Nigeria will experience a positive economic growth as a result of the planned expenditure of the federal government, especially the over 9 trillion naira that's been allocated to capital expenditure. Now, with this in mind, do you still maintain that you're not optimistic about the inflation figures?
Well, yeah, I'm actually, yes, I maintain the fact that I'm not very optimistic, right? Fine. From what the budget tells, right, we expect to see, more expenditures, across board, both recurrent and capital expenditure. However, the effect that would have on inflation is quite muted. I mean, if you look at the drivers for inflation, yeah, fine. Well, if you look at it from the food inflation dynamics, there's a news that a number of things would be done with respect to boosting agricultural inputs. I mean, hectares of farmlands being utilized for adequate food production, but a major impediment still remains insecurity, right? And that has to be sorted out. The exchange rates and quagmire also has to be sorted out. So until those two extremely important factors that have posed a negative toll on inflation. Until those two factors are sorted out, I don't think I mean, if you look at the budget benchmark for inflation, that's about 21.4%. I think that's quite extremely, not even quite optimistic. At the best, I don't given base effects factor and probably deceleration in global inflation trend, I don't think we're likely to see anything less than 25% for the year.
So, Mr. Okosile, I mean, in basic terms, it seems like the outlook isn't very good for the average Nigerian. But I wonder, in your own words, what are we going to see as far as Naira and Kobo in our pocket goes? What's the impact going to be?
Well, a no-brainer, right? With inflation, I mean, your purchasing power would be negatively affected. That is the real worth of, your Naira. While the nominal value remains the same, I mean, the worth of what your money can buy would still be negatively impacted. And well, I mean, the best you can do is just make use of or go by your personal finance nuggets. I mean, curtail your expenditure, probably as much as possible live within your means or below your means. Try as much as possible to probably front load your expenditures, because I mean, anything could happen at any point in time. Fine, we hope and we're optimistic that there would be no negative shocks both locally and globally. But I mean, we are in an high inflationary environment, and we are likely still going to maintain this in the short to medium term.
Mr. Okosile, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on this conversation. Our guest, Oluwasomi Akosile, is a research, strategy and data analyst, joining us to discuss the latest inflation figures. As of December 2023, that had risen to 28.92% based on data released by the National Bureau of Statistics. And in just a few minutes here on Now Breakfast, Naira and Kobo comes your way. We're tracking the figures and the prices in the markets. Stick with us.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
You're welcome back into it. It is Tech Now right here on Now Breakfast. My name is Stephen Imejegu. I am here with Nabila Usman. And this morning we're looking at a conversation that came to the fore on the tech journal Tech Cabal, the tech newspaper Tech Cabal. It is written by Augustine Abraham, and it looks at the idea of Nigerian tech startups getting listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange if conversations around a tech board is greenlit. Now, Augustine Abraham, as I pointed out, is a journalist with Tech Cabal, and he joins us this morning to discuss the pros and cons of this new frontier for tech startups. Mr. Abraham, good morning, and thank you for joining us on the conversation.
Good morning, Stephen. Pleased to be speaking with you about this.
Right. To jump into the deep end, I have read your article on Tech Cabal, and you don't seem to be impressed with the idea of Nigerian tech startups moving into the Nigerian Stock Exchange. Can you tell us why this is?
Well, it's really not that I'm not impressed about the idea. I think if businesses can list, I think it's a good thing if they do list, right? Everyone wants more companies to be listed publicly. It helps the stock exchange. It provides liquidity to companies so they can invest in their growth and in a transparent manner so that people who are investing know what they're investing in and what they're backing, right? So it's a good idea generally to have companies list. But we're in a peculiar position where, as if you know, most of the startups in Nigeria, they are funded mostly by foreign capital, right? Which means that basically they raise funds for their businesses in US dollars. Those funds typically are domiciled outside the country, and they're made by foreign investors. Right? So these investors, they're not Naira investors. So, there are all sorts of, small roadblocks, between a tech startup that has raised money from a foreign venture capital investor choosing or going to list on the stock exchange. But that wasn't the actual thrust of my story. Let's say it was mostly focused on the fact that because there is a gap in local investors, institutional investors, and high net worth individuals backing tech startups in Nigeria, it doesn't make any sense to just dive into wanting to get these companies to list when there is actually a gap between the relationship of these companies and the institutional guys who handle money. By institutional guys, I'm referring to pension funds, asset managers, and whatnot. Right. So I feel like the priority should be getting these companies to build those relationships with institutional investors. And
Right.
I feel like the stock exchange managers will have a greater impact on the tech ecosystem as a whole, not just on one or two companies that they may be eyeing to get listed. They will have a better impact on the tech ecosystem as a whole, and become a trusted partner if they can lean on the relationships they currently have with these institutional investors, and get them somehow involved in the startup ecosystem. That way, it's easier to pitch for a company to get listed because they're backed by Naira, funds. If they're not backed by Naira funds, it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to get listed.
Right.
So, Mr. Augustine, I want to take you back about 6 years ago, right? As of that time, there were maybe about 4 or so Nigerian tech companies that were listed on the stock exchange. And at that time, they were trading below their IPO listing price, their initial public offering. Just based on that performance, I know 6 years is a long time, so there would have been developments with a number of these companies, but that initial performance, that initial outing would be something of a discouragement for even local investors that might see tech companies as an option. Can you tell us how the landscape has changed?
Well, I think it's become a lot better. The last 2 years or so, from 2021, the Nigerian Stock Exchange has actually been on a tear. So listed companies have actually performed exceptionally well, including some of the listed tech stocks. So you think of guys like Chams, like CWG, the listed tech companies on the stock exchange, eTransact and whatnot. I think they've done pretty well for themselves. But those are different types of companies compared to the companies we're talking about today, right? And they're companies that come from a different era. And if you look at those companies, you really literally see the point I'm trying to make. They're companies that come from a place where the founders were not just Nigerian. It wasn't just a Nigerian company serving Nigerian businesses and consumers. It was a company that was founded and funded, in Naira, or at least mostly businesses were built, by people who put in local capital into it. So they had a stake from it from a Nigerian perspective, as opposed to, a European or American or an Asian who has invested USD into, these startups, which, by the way, the bulk of those funds are not actually in Nigerian banks. The bulk of those funds sit in banks in the US and elsewhere, right? And those guys, they expect a return on their investment to be made in USD. They don't expect those returns. And in fact, given the recent troubles that the Naira has had, it was also an issue, right? Because startups may be performing exceptionally well in Naira. When they report their progress in USD, it's not going very well, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, there are actually two different types of companies. You can list, right, and not perform very well. The idea of being in the stock market is being a long game. It's playing the long game, rather, right? You can list and not do very well. That's maybe not exactly the point, right? We've had startups, we've had Jumia, right, who listed in New York, who listed in the US, and they've not performed very well at all. If you wanted to compare by that metric. So it's not particularly about the Nigerian Stock Exchange or whether it's good or bad to list. If there is a company, right, and I made that point, I asked that question in that article. If there's a company today that wanted to list on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, which company would you be excited to want to own their shares in, right, as a Nigerian or as an institutional investor investing in African securities, right? That's the question. You don't have to be a Nigerian, by the way, and it's a broader question. You look at this for Nigeria, you look at it for the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, you look at it for the Egyptian Exchange, or for Nairobi. It's that same problem, right? That
Right.
I think the Nigerian Stock Exchange is ahead of getting people to list, but the problem is still there. There's a disconnect between how institutional investors think locally versus these startups that are it's strange, different beasts, and it's the best thing that could happen is if there is some partner that is trusted by both parties that can mediate that gap. The exact form that will take something I would love for the stock exchange guys to think about, and I'd really be happy to contribute to that conversation.
Mr. Abraham, to go back to your point about a lot of these tech startups, Nigerian tech startups, being funded by people outside of Nigeria, is it a case of the Nigerian investor not seeing the tech space as profitable? Is that what would explain a lack of funding for tech startups, Nigerian tech startups from Nigeria?
Yes, right, but not the only reason. You have to understand that the tech startups we're talking to, they're different from the CWGs of, I don't know, 20-something, 30 years ago. Those guys have been in the business for a long time, right? And they had a totally different business. The tech startups we're talking about these days are usually software, mostly startups, which, to be honest, right, is a completely new beast. It's not in the space of IT, relatively speaking. If you look at the history of technology, right, SaaS businesses, that software as a service businesses, are a relatively new invention. So it's not a space that a lot of people are comfortable with, right? Not just in Nigeria, by the way, right, but institutional investors in particular do not understand it. It doesn't work like how other businesses work. The valuation doesn't follow traditional valuation, expectations, which is a lot to say because, frankly, if you look at the Nigerian Stock Exchange, there are companies listed there that have valuations that look like tech startup valuations, but they are not tech startups. You have companies like Gerugu Power, you have companies like the Hilton business, Transcorp Hilton, they are valued at tech startup valuations. But generally, the idea is there are different types of businesses that are not quite understood. Maybe they are not as trusted, and there's just a lack of institutional relationships. And that gap needs to be filled.
When you say they're not as trusted, I wonder if it's the tech nature of the conversation. Because you look at some of these companies, even when you were talking about CHAMS, CWG, these are companies, eTransact as well. They're part of the companies I was referring to when you looked at 2018 and they were performing below IPO listing. But they do operate in different industries, right? Different sectors. The one commonality is that they are tech-based. It's supposed to be this innovation. It's a very broad name to say tech. But when you narrow it down, so is it perhaps a matter of the tech aspect of it? Or is it that some tech startups in certain sectors will perform better than others?
Not really. Look at CWG's business, right? What does it do? It's really a business that has a lot of hardware components. At the last Tech About event in October in Lagos last year, I had a panel which I moderated with representatives from CWG and CHAMS, and they're very good friends of Tech About. But they are different businesses. They are businesses that were started at the time when IT was just coming into Africa and becoming like a force. So there are businesses that were built on top of selling computers, like physical computers, printers and stuff like that, and networking equipment, and so on and so forth. So they're totally different businesses. They're businesses that, provided, the computers that you have in some government offices, the computers that some of these pension funds, use. So there's a sort of relationship that they understand. On the other hand, you have a business like, let's say Flutterwave, right, which is purely software. It's a pure software business. You're not going to buy a Flutterwave computer, or you're not walking into a Flutterwave warehouse or anything like that, right? So those are completely different types of businesses. And a lot, because of the nature of venture capital in Africa, which is a relatively new industry or investment asset class, that has been dominated so far by development banks, so foreign development organizations, and foreign investors as well. Because of that nature, the conversation about tech startups, speaking specifically about software companies, has tended to focus on tech startups that are has tended to focus that tech startup conversation, internationally. The conversation has tended to go between the guys who are building on the ground and the foreign people who are sort of on the other side, betting on African innovation. There's not been a lot of conversation, publicly at the very least, between the pension guys, the asset management guys. There are a few things happening here and there, but it's not very coordinated. And that is what the point of my article was, that there is an opportunity, right, for stock exchanges, both in Lagos or in any other African city, to close that gap, and play the role of being that mediator. These guys trust them. They've been investing in the stock exchange for years. And the stock exchange kind of understands and is already building rapport with the tech startup guys. Why not just take it a step further, right, and say, look, before we're cutting you guys to just simply come and list, let's help you guys be able to talk to these people. Maybe help local African VCs to raise money from institutional investors. Maybe organize private placements where these institutional investors can take stakes in some of these companies before they are even public, right? And build that relationship so that when they eventually, that way, I think you wouldn't have to do a lot of persuading to get a company to want to list publicly. At the very least, they can list the portion of their Nigerian shares publicly, and it can be traded publicly, and do a cross-listing and list, internationally for foreign investors. Something like that. I think there are different things that can come to play when you begin to really think about this. And I think I'd love to see that.
Mr. Augustine, is definitely something that we would love to see, and I would love to extend the conversation, but I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much for shining the light on what tech startups could stand to achieve in the stock exchange.
Thank you very much, Stephen. This has been a pleasure anytime. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the size of our package. We were speaking with Mr. Abraham Augustine. He's a journalist with Tech Cabal, and his article, Local Tech IPOs Are Not the Answer Yet, is on Tech Cabal. It explains exactly what we've been talking about and how much of a good idea it is for Nigerian startups to get into the Nigerian Stock Exchange. We'll be back next week with another edition of Tech Now. But for now, we ask that you stay tuned as Now Breakfast continues with Community Watch in just a moment. Do stay with us.
This is Now Breakfast.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.